The sensation begins not with a gasp, but with a subtle, hollow ache in the center of your chest. You do not notice it at first, the way you don't notice the rhythm of a clock until it stops. But then, the realization settles in, the air is no longer a gift. Every inhalation you draw right now is a resource you can never truly replace. In the time it takes for your heart to beat twice, you have consumed a substance more precious than any currency ever minted, and the world is finally coming to collect. Imagine a horizon where the lush greenery of the forest no longer offers life, but instead acts as a silent, suffocating predator, drinking the very atmosphere you need to survive. This is the chronicle of a world that simply stopped exhaling, leaving humanity to scramble for the dregs of a vanishing sky. The shift did not happen with a sudden collapse or a cinematic explosion. It began as a subtle anomaly in the high atmosphere, a biological pivot that researchers initially struggled to categorize. The plants, once our silent partners in the cycle of existence, underwent a metabolic reversal. Photosynthesis, the process that had sustained complex life for eons, flickered and changed. Instead of releasing oxygen, the trees began to crave it. The great forests of the Amazon and the Congo did not wither, they grew darker, their leaves turning a deep, bruised purple as they began to pull oxygen from the wind, hoarding it within their cellular structures. This biological pivot turned the Earth into a closed room where the windows have been locked and the heater is running on high. Within months, global oxygen levels began a slow, agonizing descent. The air grew thin, like the peak of a mountain brought down to sea level, and stayed that way. The world became a place of heavy limbs and clouded minds. Cities that once thrived on movement slowed to a crawl. As the resource dwindled, the social hierarchy was redefined by a metric known as the lung rating. Those at the top live in pressurized domes, breathing air that is crisp, filtered, and cold. The rest of the world has been forced into the shadows, learning to survive on the stale, recycled fumes of a dying planet. Levi is a man who exists in the margins of this new reality. He is one of the shallow breathers, occupying the most precarious positions in the remaining subterranean colonies. He works the dangerous shifts in the fungal mines, where the air is thick with spores and the oxygen concentration is barely enough to keep a candle flickering. Levi moves with a rhythmic, fluid grace designed to minimize the burn of lactic acid in his muscles. To an outsider, he looks like a ghost drifting through the gloom, but his silence is not peaceful, it is a desperate conservation of energy. In the mines, communication is handled through specialized sign language. To speak a full sentence is a luxury that costs a minute of consciousness, to speak a paragraph is a risk Levi cannot afford. The world outside the mines is even more treacherous. While humans built walls and scrubbers, nature underwent a rapid, brutal evolution. The creatures that survived did so by becoming living containers for the very resource they were losing. In the dark, purple forests, the Bladder-Beasts emerged as the new apex predators. These creatures, once wolves or mountain lions, are now covered in a thick, translucent membrane that wraps around their bodies like a vacuum-sealed shroud. They no longer breathe through lungs in the traditional sense, they are biological oxygen tanks. Their internal organs are suspended in a high-pressure fluid, and they hunt not for meat, but for the air trapped inside other living things. To encounter a bladder beast in the wild is to see a shimmering, silent phantom that can send a leak in an oxygen mask from miles away. They do not growl, they hiss with the sound of escaping gas, a terrifying mechanical noise coming from a biological throat. This evolutionary desperation extends deep into the oceans, creating the sunken bladders. The leviathans of the deep have transformed into buoyant anomalies of the abyss. Great whales no longer breach the surface to spray mist into the air, instead, they have become massive, floating spheres of pressurized gas. Their blowholes have fused shut, and their skin has thickened into a rubbery armor designed to hold back the crushing weight of the sea from the precious oxygen stored within their massive chest cavities. Sharks have lost their gills, replaced by pseudolung membranes that pulse around their heads, seeking out the tiny, microscopic bubbles of oxygen that occasionally escape from dying coral reefs. These predators of the deep have become silent, drifting balloons, waiting for any tremor in the water that suggests a pressurized vessel. In the new ocean, to bleed is manageable, but to leak is certain death. Above the waves and the purple canopies, the sky is occupied by the vacuum swarm. Birds no longer soar on the thermals, the air is too thin to provide lift for traditional wings. Instead, species like eagles and swifts have developed specialized air sacs beneath their wings that act as biopumps. They move through the sky in short, frantic bursts, diving through the thin atmosphere as if they were swimming through a liquid. Their bones, once hollow to allow for flight, have become dense reservoirs for high-pressure gas. They are no longer creatures of grace, but kinetic projectiles of survival. Even the insects have adapted with terrifying efficiency. Bees and ants build atmospheric hives, sealed, airtight mounds where they cultivate specific types of fungi that produce trace amounts of oxygen. These hives are under constant siege, turning the forest floor into a microscopic war zone where every skirmish is fought over a single millibar of pressure. Beneath the surface of the earth, humanity has found a desperate ally in the fungi. While the surface plants became rivals, certain subterranean mushrooms were discovered to produce a faint, steady stream of oxygen as a byproduct of breaking down organic matter. These lungs of the deep are the only reason the colonies survive. Vast, glowing caverns are filled with towering fungal stalks that pulse with a rhythmic, sickly light. Tending these gardens is a religious experience for some and a nightmare for others. The air here is damp and smells of rot, but it is air. The great fungal gardens are the most heavily guarded places on Earth, protected by soldiers who wear pressurized suits that make them look like ancient deep-sea divers. Conflict in this era is found in the Air-Heists. Imagine a dark, pressurized corridor deep underground. Levi watches from the shadows as figures huddle near a heavy steel door marked with a glowing blue symbol. This is a local atmospheric exchange, a place where the air is scrubbed and distributed. The tension is not about wealth, but about the hissing sound of a regulator. If a heist fails, the participants aren't just imprisoned, they are subjected to a process called venting. In a world with no air to spare, the punishment for theft is the immediate reclamation of the oxygen stored in the criminal's own lungs. It is a cold, mathematical justice. When a rival colony, desperate and gasping, launches a raid on a fungal garden, there are no explosions. Explosions consume too much oxygen. Instead, the battle is fought with blades and pneumatic spears. The goal is simple: puncture the enemy's suit. A single tear in a pressurized garment is a death sentence. The victim doesn't bleed out, they simply deflate, their internal pressure equalizing with the thin atmosphere of the tunnel until their lungs collapse like empty bags. It is a quiet, rhythmic slaughter, punctuated only by the clatter of metal on stone. In these dark tunnels, the Bladder-Beasts sometimes find their way in, drawn by the scent of a punctured suit. They don't take sides, they simply harvest the escaping pressure from the dying on both sides of the conflict. The domestic world has not been spared from this biological shift. In the pressurized domes of the elite, the pets of the wealthy have begun to exhibit the same horrifying traits as their wild counterparts. This domestic shift is a whispered fear among those who can still afford to live in comfort. A family dog might start to develop the characteristic translucent skin of a bladder-beast as gene-edited traits from the outside environment begin to leak into the domestic gene pool. Their barks become muffled, their ribcages expanding to accommodate the internal pressure required to survive the fluctuating levels of the domed scrubbers. Owners find themselves looking into the eyes of a creature that is slowly becoming a stranger, a living, breathing oxygen tank that might, in a moment of desperation, look at its master as a source of relief. In the midst of this, Levi finds something that shouldn't exist. Deep in a forgotten sector of an old subway system, he discovers a small, sealed glass jar. Inside, protected from the predatory atmosphere of the surface, is a single green sprout. It is a relic of the old world, a plant that hasn't yet flipped its metabolism. To anyone else, it's a death sentence, a tiny consumer that will eventually turn into a monster. But to Levi, it's a memory. It represents a time when the atmosphere was a gift. The dilemma Levi faces is the heart of this dark reality. If he keeps the plant, he must feed it his own meager supply of oxygen to keep it alive until it can grow. He must literally breathe his life into the thing that might one day kill him. But if he destroys it, he destroys the last evidence that the world was once different. Levi begins to live a double life, stealing oxygen from his workplace, risking the venting penalty every day, just to see a single green leaf unfurl in the dark. But the pressure builds, both literally and figuratively. The colony's oxygen scrubbers are failing, and the atmospheric debt is being called in. The administrators announce a thinning, a mandatory reduction in the population to preserve the remaining gas. Levi knows his lung rating is too low to survive the cut. His only hope is to flee to the surface, into the domain of the Bladder-Beasts, carrying his small glass jar like a holy relic. He believes that if he can find a way to make the sprout produce seeds, he might be able to restart the old cycle. It is a fool's errand, a journey into a vacuum with nothing but a few liters of air and a desperate hope. The surface world is a haunting landscape of purple forests and shimmering, translucent predators. Levi moves through the ruins of a once great city, his footsteps silent on the cracked asphalt. Above him, the sky is a strange, bruised color, devoid of the familiar blue. He sees a pack of Bladder-Beasts stalking a stray mechanical drone, their bodies glowing with the faint, stolen oxygen trapped beneath their skins. They are the new masters of the earth, perfectly adapted to a world that has turned its back on the lungs of man. He watches as a bladder wolf corners a small, mutated rodent. There is no struggle, only the hiss of a membrane being pierced and the visible transfer of a faint, white mist from the prey to the predator. The wolf's translucent skin ripples and firms as it absorbs the pressure. It is a biological transaction, cold and efficient. As Levi climbs toward the higher altitudes, the air becomes even more treacherous. The weight on his chest is no longer a metaphor, it is a physical force pressing against his ribs. Every step requires a conscious effort of will. His vision begins to fray at the edges, a symptom of the air hunger he has spent his life trying to avoid. He looks at the small green sprout in the jar. It has grown, its leaves pressing against the glass. In this moment, the contradiction of his existence is laid bare. He is a creature of the old world, trying to survive in a new one that has no place for him. He realizes that the sprout isn't a savior, it's a mirror. It is just as hungry and just as desperate as he is. Around him, the Bladder-Beasts wait. They can hear the frantic, uneven rhythm of his regulator. To them, Levi is not a man, he is a pressurized canister wrapped in skin. In a final, desperate confrontation at the edge of a mountain range, Levi finds himself surrounded. His oxygen tank is hissing, the needle hovering near zero. The air inside his mask is hot and wet, tasting of his own fear. He looks at the creatures, the wolves with their glass-like skin and the swifts pulsing overhead. They are not evil, they are simply the result of a world that changed its mind about who deserved to live. They have accepted the new terms of the contract. They are the living monuments to a world that no longer exhales. As the first Bladder-Beast lunges, Levi does something unexpected. He doesn't fight. He doesn't run. He unscrews the cap of the jar and breaks his own mask. For a single, glorious second, he breathes the raw, thin air of the mountain, mixed with the tiny, microscopic puff of oxygen from the sprout. It is the most expensive breath in history. It is a breath that costs him everything, a final payment on a debt he's been carrying since his first cry at birth. The Bladder-Beast stops, momentarily confused by the sudden equalization of pressure, as Levi's body begins to undergo the final, irreversible change. The world of the oxygen-starved Earth is not one of heroes and villains, but of biological imperatives. We often think of the environment as a passive backdrop to our lives, a stage that provides whatever we need. But when the stage begins to breathe, when the trees begin to count our respirations, we realize how fragile our lease on life truly is. The story of Levi and his green sprout ends in the silence of the mountains, but the condition remains. Every day, the purple forests grow a little taller, drinking a little more of the sky. The colonies dig a little deeper, chasing the fading scent of a world that used to be green. The calculation is simple, and the math is cold. There is only so much air to go around, and the planet is no longer interested in lending. The sunken bladders continue their slow, pressurized drift in the deep. The vacuum swarm continues its frantic, rhythmic pulse through the heights. They are the new baseline. The darkness isn't just in the absence of light, it's in the thinning of the air, in the quiet moment when you realize that your next breath might be the one you can't afford. Take a deep breath. Hold it for a moment. Feel the oxygen enter your bloodstream, fueling your brain and your heart. It is a simple, rhythmic motion that we take for granted, but it is an act of defiance. The air we breathe is being borrowed from a system that is increasingly under strain. The purple canopy is waiting. The bladder beasts are scenting the wind. And the world, once our greatest provider, has finally stopped exhaling. Take one last breath, and remember that in the end, everything we take from the earth must eventually be returned. The silence of the future is not the silence of peace, but the silence of a world holding its breath, waiting to see who will be the last to let go.